there, 5 and 6. It's me, Mr. A, back with story time on this Monday, and welcome. We're going to carry on with Oversea Under Stone, chapter 13. All right, let's see what happens to Barney and the others. So, the grey house was as calm and empty as it had been when they left. "Barney!" Simon shouted up the stairs. "Barney?" His voice dwindled away uncertainly. "He can't be inside," Jane said. "The key was still in his hiding place." "Oh, Simon, what can have happened to him?" She turned back anxiously to the open front door and stared down the hill. Simon came back down the dark, shadowy hall to join her in the pool of sunlight. "He must have missed us in the harbour." "But surely he'd have come back here after that. There isn't a soul about down there now. They've all gone after the band. That awful Bill passed us. You don't think—" "No," Simon said hastily. "Anyway, Barney's got Rufus with him. He can't get into much trouble. You wait, he'll be back soon. I expect he's found Gummery and they're looking for us." He was turning back into the house when Jane suddenly shouted joyfully, "Look, you're right!" Rufus was loping up the hill towards them, a swift streak of red on the grey road, but they could see no one behind him. Cat. Jane called, and he raised his muzzle and trotted more quickly up the steps, between their legs and into the house. Then he stood facing them, his long ribbon of a tongue dangling over his jaws. But his tail was down, and there was none of the bouncing, barking delight with which she usually came home. No sign of Barney. Jane came slowly in from the doorstep. She looked down at Rufus. "What is it then? What's happened?" The dog took no notice of her. He stood there apathetically, his eyes blank. Even when they had given him a drink of water and taken him into the room overlooking the harbour, he still gave no sign that they knew he was home. It was as if he were thinking of something quite different. "I expect it's the heat," Simon said. He sounded unconvinced. "Come on, there's nothing we can do except wait. The yacht's still down in the harbour anyway." "That doesn't mean anything," Jane said miserably. "Well, it does mean—" But Simon had no chance to explain. Jane had clutched his arm nervously. He saw that she was staring at Rufus. They could never explain it afterwards. It was as if Rufus had been lying there listening for something, and had at last caught the thing he was waiting for, though they knew that they had heard no sound at all. He raised his head, his eyes so wide open that the whites were showing, and stood up slowly in a way more like an old man than a dog. His ears were pricked, and his muzzle raised high, pointing straight at something they could not see. He began to walk, very slowly and deliberately, towards the door. Mesmerised, Simon and Jane followed. Rufus went into the hall until he reached the front door, and stood waiting. He did not turn his head, he simply stood there rigid, looking ahead at the door, as if quite certain that they knew what he wanted them to do. Simon reached forward, glancing nervously down at the long, straight red back, and opened the door. And they stood on the step watching in complete bewilderment as Rufus stalked with the same ageless confidence straight ahead across the road. When he reached the other side, he leapt up with a quick light flurry to stand erect on the wall, which kept the road from the sheer 60-foot drop down to the harbour side. He seemed to be looking out to sea. "He's not going to jump?" Jane jerked in alarm, but found that she was whispering. And then they heard the noise that they never afterwards forgot. Barney knew, dimly, that he had been taken out of the big silent house and driven away in a car, and that now they were walking in a group with the noise of the sea somewhere near, but he was not certain how many of them there were, or where they were taking him. Since the moment in the shadowy room when those blazing dark eyes had glared into his face, he had been conscious of nothing except that he was to do as he was told. He no longer had any thoughts of his own. It was a strange, relaxed feeling, as if he were comfortably half asleep. There could be no argument now, no fighting. He knew only that the tall, dark figure walking at his side, wearing a wide-brimmed black hat, was his master. Master. Who else had used that word that day? "Come, Barnabas," said the hypnotic deep voice above him. "We must hurry. The tide is going out. We must reach the yacht." "Reach the yacht," said Barney dreamily to himself. "We're going out in the sea." That was the sea he could smell. the water lapping beside them at the edge of Trewhisk Harbour. Far away, as if it came from a great height, he heard Polly Withers' voice say urgently, "Anyone can see us from the road up by the house. They'll see us, I know they will." "Polly," said the same deep, slow voice, "I am the one who sees. If our old Cornish friend has done her work well, there will be no one there. And if the other two children have been let slip, well, are they a match for us?" Somewhere Mr. Withers laughed, soft and sinister. Barney walked on, like a machine. The air was warm and thick. He could feel the sun fierce on his face. He had heard them talking ever since they left the house, but nothing they said seemed to have meaning for him any more. He was not frightened. He had forgotten Simon and Jane. He was somehow floating outside himself, watching with mild interest while his body walked along, but feeling nothing at all. And then, like the sudden snapping of a bow, the noise came. Into the air above their heads a dog howled, a long, weird note so unexpected and anguished that for a moment they all stopped dead. It echoed slow through the harbour, a freezing, inhuman wail that had in it all the warning and terror that ever was in the world. Even Mr. Hastings stood listening, paralysed, and the Barney who was outside Barney, floating half detached in the air, felt the noise wake him up with a savage jolt. He looked up and saw Rufus standing above him, outlined red against the sky, with the sound still throbbing from his throat. And suddenly he knew where he was, and that he must get away. He swung round on his heel, ducked under the arms that grabbed too late to catch him, and raced along the quay towards the road. The hill was empty, drained of people by the carnival procession, and he was 25 yards clear of the confused group on the quay before they could properly begin to give chase. He heard the shouts and pounding feet behind him, and flung himself up the hill towards the grey house. Simon and Jane stared in amazement from the steps. Suddenly there had been Rufus's blood-chilling howl. Now suddenly Barney, with 4 threatening figures at his heels. They ran instinctively down the steps towards him, and then swung back in alarm at the worst sound of all. Behind him, the door of the grey house had slammed, and the key was inside. Barney staggered up to them, and Rufus came bounding down from the wall. Jane said, panic-stricken, "Which way?" Simon turned frantically to the great wooden door in the wall which was the grey house's side entrance. That was a tongue twister. Often it was kept locked. He pressed the latch, his heart thumping. Relief flooded over him in a wave as the door opened, and he pushed it wide. "Quick!" he yelled. The 4 figures pounding grim and intent at Barney's heels were only a few steps behind. Jane and Barney shot inside the door, with Rufus a swift red flurry among their feet. The wall itself seemed to shake as Simon slammed the door shut and hurriedly pushed home the 3 big iron bolts. They ran up the cold little narrow alley between the side of the grey house and the house next door, and paused at the far end. Outside, footsteps skidded up to the door. They saw the latch rise as someone on the other side pressed it. It rattled angrily, and there was a thump against the door. And then there was silence. "Suppose they climb over the wall," Jane whispered fearfully. "They couldn't possibly," Simon whispered back. "It's too high. Perhaps they'll break the door down. Well, those bolts are jolly strong. Anyway, people would see them and get suspicious. Listen, they've gone away." They all strained their ears. There was no sound from the door at the other end of the alley. Rufus looked up at them inquiringly and whined, whistling plaintively through his nose. "What are they doing? They must be up to something." "Quick," Simon said decisively. "We've got to get away from the house before they have time to get around the back. They'll have it surrounded soon." In panic, they ran into the little back garden and up through the knee-high grass to the hedge at the top. Rufus bounded round them cheerfully, jumping to lick Barney's face. He seemed to have forgotten that uncanny impulse that had made him utter that one long-lost howl, and now he was behaving as if everything were just a great game. "I hope that dog's going to keep quiet," Jane said anxiously. Simon peered through a gap in the hedge. "He will," Barney said. He bent down and cupped one hand gently over Rufus's long red muzzle, murmuring to him under his breath. Simon straightened up. "It's all clear, come on." One by one they slipped out of the garden and into the road that curved behind the houses from the harbour along the edge of Kamare Head. Oh, Jane said in sudden anguish. If only we knew where Gummery had gone. Barney said, horrified. Didn't you find him? What about Mrs. Polk? No, we didn't find him. We did see Mrs. Polk, but we couldn't get to her through the crowd. Didn't you see him? Why were they chasing you? Where did you come from? We thought something awful must have happened when Rufus came back on his own, but we didn't know where to look for you. Wait a minute, Barney said. The shock of waking from his bewitched daze was turning into an enormous sense of urgency. A dozen things that he had heard in the last hour were dodging about in his mind. As he began to see their meaning, he was feeling more and more alarmed. Simon, he said earnestly, we've got to get the Grail. Now. Even without Great Uncle Merry. There isn't time to look for him. Or wait or anything. I think they're very nearly onto it. Only not quite. That's why they wanted me. First thing is to get away from here. Simon looked about him wildly. They could come up either way from the harbour. We'll have to get off the road and hide in that field at the back of the headland. The land doesn't slope there. We ought to be able to find a way to keep hidden. They crossed the road and came out into the fields at the bottom of Kamare Head. The sun blazed high up in the sky still, beating down with a heat that pressed on them like a giant hand. But not even Jane was worrying about the chances of sunstroke now. As they reached the hedge on the far side of the first field, they heard voices. They scrambled hastily through the hedge without pausing to look round, and flattened themselves in the long grass on the other side. Barney slid his arm apprehensively over Rufus's back, but the dog lay quiet, with his long pink tongue lolling about. Nobody saw quite where they came from, but suddenly the figures were standing there on the road. Mr. Withers, slight and stooping a little, darting his head about like a weasel. The boy Bill, walking wary and belligerent in his bright shirt, and towering over them both, the tall, menacing figure in black, a dark gash across the heat-wavering summer day. Watching, Simon thought suddenly of the desperate day when threatening feet were pounding after him, down a lonely road, and he turned his eyes away from the man. The girl's not there, Barney hissed. She must be watching from the front, in case we try to come out that way again. Down on the road, the little group stood for a moment, irresolute. Bill turned and peered across the field, straight towards the hedge. The three children flattened themselves closer to the ground, hardly daring to breathe. But Bill looked away again, apparently satisfied. Withers looked across the field as well, and said something to him, and the boy shook his head. The tall figure in black had been standing a little way apart, motionless. It was difficult to tell which way he was looking. All at once he raised his arm, pointing seaward to the rising bulk of Kamare Head. He seemed to be talking earnestly. "What are they going to do?" Jane whispered. Cramp was beginning to gnaw agonisingly at her right leg, and she was longing to move. "If they're going to the end of the headland, we're sunk," Simon said, low and strained. "How many more of them are there, for goodness sake? That tall man." Jane stared at him through the erratic leaf-starred gaps in the hedge. She could not see his face, but a cold sense of familiarity was beginning to grow in her mind. Then, as she gazed, he took off his wide black hat for a moment to brush his hand across his forehead, and suddenly she knew the shape of his head, with the dark, thick suit. The pattern of twigs and grass and sunlight swirled before her eyes, and she clutched at Simon's arm. "Simon, it's him again. I know that," Simon said. "The moment he came round the corner I knew. I thought you did." "He's the boss of all of them," Barney whispered in the same urgent undertone. "His name's Hastings." "That's right," Jane said faintly. "Hastings, the vicar." Barney wriggled a little in the grass to stare at her. "He's not the vicar." "He is. I saw him at the vicarage." "Oh, you remember." All right. So, we'll pick that up tomorrow. We'll finish off chapter 13. Meantime, thanks for watching, listening, and I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye-bye.